Hello everyone, hope you all are doing well. So these past couple of days I've been working on understanding and using SpringBoot. So I thought logging it using a video would be a good way to brush up the concepts. So without wasting time, let's get into it. So we'll be discussing two small, very basic projects I created recently. We will also try to explore some interesting dependencies like Swagger or JASYPT, that is Java Simplified Encryption, and Thymeleaf. We are also going to explore two very interesting ways you can actually deploy these Spring Boot applications. One would be the Heroku, and the other would be spinning up a server instance using AWS. Okay, so coming to the first project, this is a very simple project which utilizes the API offered by NASA. If we do a simple Google search, NASA API, you can go through the official website, and this is where you can get yourself an API key which is necessary. And this is where you can browse all the APIs available. So we'll be using 2-3 APIs out of all these, given all the technicality. And so for example, we'll be using this one API. This is an astronomy picture of the day. We'll be also using Mars rover photos, which will display all the which will display a couple of photos captured from the Mars rover. And we'll also be using a tech port which provides information about the projects NASA is working on currently. And so I have made a note of all the URLs along with the access key. So if we try to see how this the kind of data it returns, let's use Postman to check. Okay, so here it is. Let's just paste it, make a GET request. So this is the data which we are receiving. This is the request for the astronomical picture of the day. So this is the URL of the image. So we have data coming in, and let's try to hit one more URL, which is the collection of photos from the Mars rover. Let's make a GET request and see what's coming in. So you have a pretty big JSON response. You have collection of photos, a lot of information regarding the rover, the areas, the cameras, etc. We can utilize all this information, display as we want to. So now that we have all our API URLs, we can go ahead and set up a small basic Spring Boot project. So we have our model class, we have the individual classes for all the APIs which we are going to hit, and moreover we have defined all the URLs in this very specific class as global constants which we'll be using. And the API calls class is where this is where we make the HTTP GET request, get the data from the API URLs, create the objects of their corresponding model classes, and returning it to the controller. So let's have a look at the controller. It's a very simple controller. So for the sake of simplicity, we are hitting all the URLs as soon as this very controller method is called. So now, as you can see, so we are using Thymeleaf for the front end. I personally felt Thymeleaf to be pretty much easier to work on, as it's more like HTML. That makes it more readable and easy to write. I would like to state that it's my personal preference for picking Thymeleaf over JASYPT for small projects. So all you have to do is add the corresponding dependency for Thymeleaf and you're good to go. Now coming back to the controller class, now if you can see, we have created a new if you could see this very specific line, this is where you create a simple HTML page and send out all the data to the page. And so let's have a look at the front-end HTML page. So as you can see, there's not much difference. It's just these very specific syntaxes you have to follow. For Thymeleaf, you can find the detailed documentation on Thymeleaf official site. So it's pretty much straightforward. So what we are doing is we are having 3 APIs. One is your astronomical picture of the day, one is your Mars rover photos, and the third one is the techport info. Let's have a look at application properties. Again, there's not much here. We've just defined the server port the application would be running on. Now if we run the application okay, let's try to access this. This is running on 7701 and this is the controller mapping. So this is a simple page which shows all the information. You have the astronomical picture of the day, you have collection of Mars rover photos, you have the techport info. Here it is. So now as you can see, we have all information in place. It's coming in just fine. So what I did was I went ahead and downloaded a Bootstrap template available. There are plenty of Bootstrap templates available. You can go ahead and download any one of them. I did too, and let's try to change the HTML page name here. So let's name it home. Let's save it. That should reload the application. Now if we go ahead and refresh it here, let's wait for a couple of seconds. Here it is, a much more visually appealing way. That's the way the template was. So we have the astronomic picture of the day here, and we have the collection of Mars rover photos along with the information. This is how we have created the template class, the model class I mean. So this is again the collection of your Mars rover photos, and this is the information from the techport API. And yes, that's pretty much it. Okay, so coming to the next project, I personally had very good time working on exploring the answers to some of the doubts I had, and this project is about creating an API which uses a database where the data is actually stored. We devise functions to perform the basic CRUD operations, that is creating, retrieving, updating and deleting of data. Now most of the cases, the configurations, that is the credentials of the database, the URLs, some important parameters, they are usually stored in application.properties. So we'll be using JASYPT, which stands for Java Simplified Encryption, to encrypt these important variables, which might include your database URL, the username and passwords to access the database, etc. We'll also be using Swagger as it provides much more simple yet very great interface to test out how the API is functioning. And when it comes to database, we'll be using H2. H2 is an open source lightweight Java database, and I personally think H2 is a very good database for trying out such basic projects. So now let's jump right in and let's explore the pom.xml first. So this is where we have all our dependencies defined. Here's the dependency for H2, there's the dependency for Swagger, and here's the dependency for JASYPT, that is the Java encryption. These are all the dependencies for Java encryption, and there's one more plugin which will add, that is a plugin, this very specific plugin for the Java encryption. So first we'll try to run the application without having all the variables encrypted. Initially we'll try to implement the functioning of H2 database. We'll try to test it out with Swagger, and then we'll move on to the Java encryption. So the kind of data we'll be storing or retrieving would be a vocab word, which would be a word having its meaning, having a demo sentence for that. So let's have a look at how the model class is. So as you can see the variables here, we have the ID, that would be the identifier, and we have the word, we have the meaning, we have the sentence. So we have those corresponding constructors and the getters and setters. So one interesting thing is we are using a sequence here. So the value of ID would be automatically incremented. So that's one thing. And now moving on to the service part. This is where we define all our basic functions to getting all the words from the database, adding a new word, editing an existing word, and deleting an existing word. And we have some transactional queries defined in the repository class here. So the one of the query would be finding the word by using ID and the word, and one other method querying the parameters would be deleting the word using ID and the word. So we are basically using the combination of ID and word to identify word, making it more accurate. And now coming on to the config class. So this is where we have defined the Swagger configuration. So it's basically just some basic information about the API, the licenses, the descriptions, and so on. And now coming on to the controller, this is again where we are defining the methods to which in turn call methods defined in the service class. So this is where all the data comes in, goes into the database, and when the data is being retrieved from the database, it is shown here. So this is how it's all defined in the terminologies of Swagger. So these are all the API parameters, as these parameters are the input parameters for adding a new word. So these are all the API parameters coming in. Again, the same thing goes for edit and delete vocab as well. Now that we have covered the Swagger configuration, let's have a look at the application.properties. So this is where we are using, that's the port number, and now these are all the configurations for the H2 database. Now H2 here is actually an in-memory database, but using this very URL, we are going to make it store, that is, the data will be persisted even if the application gets shut down. So it basically creates a file and stores data in that, and whenever the application resumes, it picks the data from that file again. So these are all the couple of parameters again. So this is where we are defining a custom URL for accessing the H2 database. I'll show you that in a minute. And we have the console enabled as well. Now here the important things to notice are the username and password. As you can see, they are just out there in the open for anyone to access. So it makes sense if we could encrypt these important variables, and that would add up a layer of security. Now that we have had a look at the most important concepts of the application, let's actually go ahead and run the application and have a look at the database console as well as the Swagger interface. Okay, so here it is, the application is running. So this is our custom URL which we have assigned for accessing our H2 console. So let's go ahead and try accessing the URL. All you have to do is append the custom URL after the port number. So the URL would go something like this. Here it is. So the JDBC URL is this very specific URL which we have in place. So our data or username to access the database would be your SA and password would be password. So let's try accessing the console. I've entered the password, connect. So this is the default H2 console. As you can see, we have a table created here automatically. So we have all the columns here based on the model class definition. If you can see the model class again, this is our model class and here's the definition. So based on these very column names, the columns in the database are created. So now let's try to access the Swagger interface. So that would again be appending swagger-UI.html after the port number. So the URL would go something like this. So here is our controller. We just have one controller in place, so that's the reason we are able to see one controller, which consists all the 4 methods to perform the CRUD operations on database, which would be adding a new word, getting a list of all words, deleting one word based on its ID and the word itself, and editing. So now let's try to run. This is let's see if we have any. We don't have any data, obviously. So now let's go ahead and add one word here. So the word would be just demo one sentence, meaning demo one sentence. Let's execute it. So as you can see, this has we've gotten 200 as a response, so that means the data is stored. Let's try to run this method. So we should be able to see the word coming up here. Here it is. Now let's go ahead and try to edit this word. Let's edit. So the ID would be 65 and the word would be demo 1. So the ID is 65 here and the word is demo 1. Let's change the meaning and the sentence. Demo 1 meaning 2, demo 1 sentence 2. Let's execute. Okay, so now let's try to again run the get all word method. So as you can see, the meaning and sentence has been changed here. So that is, the word has been updated. Now let's go ahead and also try out the delete. So the ID again would be 65. Let's enter 65 and the word would be demo 1. So I'm entering the demo 1. Let's execute it. We've gotten 200 as a response. Now that we try to run this very specific function, we shouldn't be able to see any data, as all the data has been deleted. We just had one word entered, we edited it, we deleted it. So that's how the basic flow of data is being performed in this very specific application. Alright, so now that when we move on to implementing the JASYPT encryption, so all you have to do is all the parameters, all the variables which you would want to encrypt from your application.properties, you'll just have to wrap it up in this way, in this very specific way. I've just duplicated these values just to see how these values change after being encrypted, and we also have all our dependencies in place. So now there's one more thing which we need to make change, is in the main application you would just need to add this very specific annotation which would enable the entire application to access these variables after decrypting them. So now let's try to run the application. It should actually fail because the value of ID and password should not be able using these values, it won't be able to connect to the database. That's the reason the application fails here. So now when we actually there's one thing which we need to do in the run configurations. If we go ahead and have a look at the Maven build configurations. So what I've done is I've just replicated the existing configuration, and in the goals I've added this very specific command here. So this is where this would be our encryptor and decryptor password, which will be used. Now that let's run and see what happens. Okay, so we have received the build as success. Now let's actually close this application properties and reopen. Now as you can see, these two values have been encrypted, and we have these two values commented out just for reference. So this is how the values change. Okay, so while running the application, we'll also need to add the decryptor password while running the application. So again, we'll go to run configurations and under SpringBoot. For this very specific application, we'll add this argument here, the VM argument. Again, we'll specify the encryptor and decryptor password here. Now let's run here. If we run the application, it should ideally run. Okay, so the application is up and running successfully. As we can see, if we try to access Swagger, here it is, we are able to access. So as you can see, the values are still encrypted here. Now moving on to the next step would be creating a jar of this application so that it can be deployed. So again, we would be using the Maven command in addition, and along with the encryptor password, we'll also specify that very argument. So this is how we can do that. In the run configurations for Maven build, we can add one more configuration here that would be having the goal of clean install, which would create a jar file, and we'll also specify the encryptor password for that. So let's go ahead and run. Now this should ideally create a jar file under the target folder. Let's wait for this to finish up. Now that we have gotten the build success message, let's go ahead and have a look at the target folder. So this is our jar file which we can deploy. Let's have a look about how to run this application using jar file locally. So what I'll do is I'll show in the System Explorer. Here is the jar file. Let's fire up CMP. So this is how we ideally run the application on the jar file, java-jar API, the name of the jar file. And this should ideally fail because we haven't specified the additional parameter, the password, which the application is supposed to use to decrypt the variables. So what we'll just need to add the parameter here, and the command would be something like this. So again, we just added the additional password parameter, and the jar file would be the same. Now this time it should ideally run the application, picking the password which we specified. Okay, so the application is up and running. Let's try to access the Swagger. Okay, so this Swagger implementation is actually being run from the jar file, not the SpringBoot application from the ID. As you can see, there's nothing running up here. So that's how we can encrypt the important credentials which are being stored in the application.properties, and that's how we can create a jar file. That's how we can run the jar file locally. So now as you can see, let's refresh. So this is actually coming in from the jar file. This is not coming in from the ID. As you can see, there's nothing running here. So the credentials stored in the application properties have been they are being decrypted and being utilized to connect to the database. So this is how we can implement the JASYPT encryption. Now coming to the second most interesting aspect of this video, that would be deploying those applications. It would be fun if we would be able to deploy this application into some environment and accessing these applications through an external URL rather than running on the local system. That would be great. So what we'll be doing is we'll be deploying the first application, that is the project using the NASA API. We'll be deploying that application into Heroku, while the second application we would be deploying using the jar file the way we did just now. We would be actually going ahead and we'll be creating an AWS instance. It would be a small server. We would be moving the jar file into that server. We'll try to run the application there and we'll see how that performs. I think it would be pretty interesting. Let's jump right into it. So this is our first application. So what I did was I went ahead and checked this code into GitHub. I'll be mentioning the GitHub link in the description. So let's actually close this. Let's actually stop the application. So if we can see, this is where I have uploaded all of my code regarding the NASA API project. So what we'll do is, and this is Heroku, it's a pretty straightforward sign-in process. So under the home page, all we have to do is we have to create a new application. So let's go ahead and create a new application. I would name it something like Venki API project NASA API. Okay, let's keep it NASA, and the region really doesn't matter here. Let's create the application. Okay, so all we have to do is connect our GitHub profile here, select the corresponding repository, and we are good to go. So I have already connected my GitHub profile. So this is my GitHub username, and all we have to do is specify the repository name here. This would be the API project underscore NASA. Let's paste it here. Let's do a search. So that has detected the repository. Now simply let's connect. Let's give it some time. There's not much we have to do here. Let's just click on deploy branch. Now this should take some time as it builds up. Okay, so as you can see, the app was successfully deployed. Now if we actually click on view, we are getting this error because the mapping, the API mapping is missing here. Let's have a look at API NASA. Here's the source. Let's have a look at the controller method. The request mapping for that very specific method would be something like, okay, here it is. Let's just copy this and let's just add it here. Okay, so as you can see, the application has loaded up. The URL, this is the custom URL which we've gotten from the Heroku application. So here's the application completely up and running. I think it's a pretty simple yet interesting way you can try and test out your application after you're done testing it out on a local system. I think this would be a fun way to share the application which you've developed. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and to deploy this application into a dedicated server instance, we can go ahead and get yourself a simple ID created in AWS, and under the free tier usage section, we can go ahead and select, we can spin a very basic server instance that could be the Unix server instance, and after that it's a pretty simple process. All we have to do is just copy the jar file into the server instance and run the same command that would actually start the application, and we can access this very application which is being run on the server through the server URL, just the way we did it just the way we access the application using the Heroku URL. So these are the two interesting ways I thought we can have our applications deployed and shared with people. So that's all for this video. I have attached all the source code the notes I've made for this, the small pointers I've made for this this entire process of implementing different dependencies like JASYPT. You can go ahead and check the code, check the notes, check the pointers from GitHub. You can find the links to this very GitHub repository in the description section. So I think yeah, that's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.